on the internet, but you had to know to look, you know, and you know where to look and so on. It's the same question. So yeah, the internet can be a very effective democratizing tool if it's used.
Thank you, Professor, for your presence here. I think we all certainly appreciate it. I'm trying to give you as much freedom as possible on this question, so I'm just going to ask it. What do you make of Israeli settlement in the West Bank?
In the West Bank? With regard to the West Bank?
In the West Bank in particular, the
West
continued settlement activity and the history of it.
Well, Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. Israel was informed at once by its own top legal advisors, Theodore Meron, famous international lawyer, the Attorney General, and others, that any settlement in the West Bank was illegal, in violation of the core principles of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions. But they decided to go ahead anyway. That's in violation of Security Council resolutions. There's a World Court resolution decision about it. But since the U.S. backs the settlement, none of this exists. It exists in the fact, but not in operative fact, because the U.S. supports the settlement. So they settled in the West Bank, settled in Gaza, settled the Golan Heights, all illegal. And in the early stages, it was kind of conflicted, like how much do you do? But there's an old tradition, goes back to the origins of the Zionist movement, and that is put off diplomacy as much as possible and build facts on the ground. That was done under the British Mandate. It was done since. The few exceptions were sort of understood as tentative, get a basis, and we go on from there. Now, it's very hard to criticize that, because there isn't any other way. It's hard to think of another way of taking over a country where the population doesn't want you. How else do you do it? In fact, look at our own history. Why are we here? Well, because we exterminated the population. It's true that there were a lot of treaties made, but the colonies just broke them when they felt like it. There's a whole record of broken treaties. So you make a treaty, but you don't really mean it, and then you establish facts, and you go on to the next step, and finally you've taken over the country. 10 million people or so gone, but who cares about that? And in fact, I suspect that part of I don't know how to prove this, but I suppose that part of the popular support for Israel comes from the resonance to our own historical experience. And there's striking similarities. I mean, even the so-called, what's called the providentialism is the same. The United States began as a fanatically religious society, way off the spectrum. It still is. But one component of that is providentialism. The idea that God has has determined what's going to happen in history, and you, the chosen people, rather we, the chosen people, because it's always us, are the agents of history. So anything that happens, it's carrying out God's mission. That's a major theme of American history right up to the present. And it's the settler movement, too, in Israel is driven by something very similar. Well, in any event, the settlements extended. By now, East Jerusalem was annexed in violation of Security Council resolutions. The settlements are carefully planned. There's a plan to take over the arable land and the valuable resources in the Jordan Valley, which is about a third of the West Bank, so it's enclosed, and to break the rest up into essentially unviable cantons. Moshe Dayan, who was defense minister in the early stages, and among the leadership was one of the most sympathetic to Palestinians. He'd kind of grown up with them. He understood their problems. His picture was, we shall tell to the cabinet right away in 1967, he said, we'll tell the Palestinian population that we can do nothing for them. They will live like dogs, and anyone who wants to leave can leave. And we'll see where that'll go. Now, he compared it to a Bedouin capturing a young woman who he wants to marry. So he captures the young woman doesn't like it, and so on, but finally she kind of gets used to it. Okay, that's what we'll be like. And that's pretty much what was implemented, with a very strongly messianic component, often struggling against the military, violating military orders, violating government orders, but implementing this plan. Well, how does the population feel about it? They're kind of mixed. I mean, a large percentage of the settlers are people who were subsidized to live in the pleasant suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which happen to be in the West Bank. It's kind of like, where I live in the suburbs around Boston. I kind of like living there. But, and if you look back far enough, of course, people were dispossessed. There used to be people living there. But this is, more immediate and closer. So those people, they don't have a messianic attachment to the nice places where they're subsidized to live. And in a political settlement, they would just leave. But there is a sector of extremist, fundamentalist, religious Jews, many of them from Brooklyn, places like that, and they're kind of unpredictable. But the general population inside Israel, if you look at polls, it's kind of split. I mean, if there's a poll question that says, if we had peace, would you give up the territories? A large percentage says yes, maybe half or so. On the other hand, when it comes to a decision like the elections today, it's going to be the opposite. I mean, the predictions from the elections are that the extreme nationalist forces, jingoist forces, are going to have a considerable victory. There's almost nothing left of the peace movement on the left. The Kadima, the so-called centrist party, has already taken over the position of the most extreme nationalist, Avigdor Lieberman, that says the Palestinians of Israel ought to leave. If we have some kind of a settlement, some way or other we'll get them to leave. So the tendencies are in a pretty ugly direction. And that's what happens in the case of national conflict. I mean, take, say, Northern Ireland. Take an example. As it's not identical, but there's some similarities. I mean, the Catholic population was very badly treated under it was imperial invasion by Britain, and the British, the Protestant group was the dominant one. And there was plenty of repression of the Catholic community, and they resisted. The resistance led to terror, very severe terror. IRA terror was not a joke. The British responded with more terror, and it got worse and worse. Hatreds got worse and worse. Actually, I was in Belfast in 1993. It was a war zone, But finally, the British got the idea that instead of responding to terror by more violence, they should pay some attention to the legitimate grievances. Okay, and they did, and they reached it's not utopia, but it's a pretty peaceful place. The violence subsided. There's no more terror, and the person who implemented this is George Mitchell. I mean, he's the one who Obama picked as his emissary, but nobody's concluding, well, let's take a look at his experience. What happened is when the grievances received some attention, the resistance and the terror declined, and finally it led to a settlement. There's no reason why that couldn't happen in the occupied territories if the U.S. would agree to it. I can't go through the whole history here, but the fact is that for over 30 years, the U.S. has, in isolation, along with Israel, blocked a political settlement, which almost everybody wants, including Hamas, including Hezbollah, including Iran. And the U.S. alone has blocked it. And the U.S. is the international godfather. If it blocks something, it's gone. That can change too.
I'd like to just extend a little bit on a topic that you've already touched on, and ask you to talk about your sense of the positionality of the Obama administration vis-a-vis the reorganization of private interests within the public sphere. And related to that is, the use of discourse or ideological tools by the Obama campaign and now administration, and use of media to do that work.
So would there be an effect on the private-public sector? I doubt it very much. I mean, there has to be something, because the private sector